How's it going, everyone? It's Blake with ChessPathways.com, and today we're doing another game analysis video from one of our members. This was a game sent to me by Jazeerajam, who had the black pieces here, so let's actually flip the board so we get it from their perspective. And e4, e5, and f4. And they say King's Gambit. They have no idea how to play against this, so they decide to ignore it and just develop and get castled soon. And that's a reasonable approach against the King's Gambit. You do have to be careful, though, because a lot of times the best way to refute, or even not to refute, but just to play against a gambit is going to be to accept it. Because if you don't accept this pawn on f4, white's still going to get a lot of their advantages they would get out of the King's Gambit. This open f-file, the active bishop here, the target on f7, and they're not even going to be down a pawn for it. So in general, I would recommend if you don't know how to play against this gambit, if you see some gambit you've never played against before, go ahead and accept it. And if you get blown off the board, if you get crushed, fine. You can go after the game, analyze what happened, and come up with a system to play against that gambit in the future so it won't surprise you again. But there's nothing wrong with knight c6. So let's take a look at knight c6. White plays bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight f3. You decided to capture this free pawn on e4. And after white plays f takes e5 here, you played the move bishop to c5, and you give the comment it stops your opponent from castling. Which it does temporarily, but as you kind of gathered later, you start talking about how good white's pawn chain looks. d4 is a move white really wants to play anyway. It helps strengthen their center. And you're allowing them to play this move with tempo, meaning that you're going to have to move your bishop again, and now it's white's turn again, and obviously you didn't stop white from castling at all, right? You did say you're happy here because your bishop's more active on b6 than it might have been on e7, and that is true. But let's go back a couple moves and take a look at some alternatives here. So after your opponent took on e5, it turns out that you can actually take this pawn on e5. And this is a very tactical line. I wouldn't necessarily expect someone to be able to calculate this out all the way. The important thing is, did you look at it? Did you look at this move and try to see if it works? Because after your knight gets taken, there's this move queen h4. And this is very common in the King's Gambit, or a lot of openings where the f-pawn moves, that the side moving the f-pawn always has to watch out along that diagonal. And here the tactics just turn out to work for black. After g3, knight takes g3, bishop takes f7, king d8. It turns out the king is safe enough, and white has some trouble dealing with this pressure. So this is very complex. It is a hard line to evaluate. I wouldn't expect a 1200, 1300 player to be able to calculate this out all the way. If you saw the possibility and ended up rejecting it, that completely is understandable. The important thing is, though, to be aware of this tactical idea that if this knight leaves, you have all these threats along the diagonal, and after g3, this is going to be a pawn you can take because of the pins and everything. It's important to kind of understand that pattern. So if you've never seen that pattern before, now you have. And this pops up in a lot of openings. Just to take a little detour, after e4, e5, knight f3, if black plays the bad move here, f6, white can actually take this pawn on e5 because a similar kind of idea works out. Here g6 isn't possible, not because of a knight taking it, but because of this fork. You always have to be careful moving that f-pawn early. And when your opponent does it, you should be looking for opportunities to take advantage of it. But okay, going back to the position after bishop c5. Again, if you saw d4 and you saw you're okay with this, you're okay with that, your bishop's going to be on this more active diagonal, again, that's fine, but it sounds to me like you didn't see d4. And I'm wondering, if you ask the question, what would I do if I were my opponent here? Which I've been preaching in every one of these game analysis videos. It's such an important habit to always ask that question when you make a move. And again, I think if you would have asked, what's my opponent going to do here? Well, if I'm white here, well, I can't castle. I'd really like to play d4. I can solve both problems at once. Of course I'm going to play d4, right? So again, just a reminder to really build that habit up and just always ask before you make a move, what's my opponent going to do in response to this move? Anyway, d4, bishop b6, and your opponent castles. Oh, by the way, I'm realizing now, after d4, does the same idea work that would have worked before with just taking and deflecting that knight away? If we take on d4, I'm pretty sure this is good for black. It looks like this pawn is safe, right? Because there's two defenders of the pawn and we have two attackers. I don't think white can do this, though. After knight takes d4, we just win that pawn. And if they take back, I think queen h4 is still very good for us. Yeah, this is still hard to evaluate, I guess, but I'm struggling to see what black does here. We're threatening discoveries on the king. We have two attackers on the knight. Yeah, what does white do here, actually? I think this is really good for black. So it seems like you just weren't aware of this pattern, that you can always try to deflect this knight away, and there's always going to be this queen h4 and these nasty threats down the diagonal here. Okay, but we can go ahead and keep going in the game after white was allowed to castle. So after castles, you played h6, and you said this is to stop an attack on your f7 pawn. So that's an interesting comment, because knight g5 isn't really possible right away, because your knight's controlling that square, if that's the threat you were talking about. And even if you're worried about threats to f7, doesn't castling do an efficient job of stopping them? Now your rook and king are both defending f7, and you got to castle, which of course is a good thing. Usually when the position is as open as this position is, there's lots of threats, it's a tactical position. You can't afford to make slow pawn moves like h6. But okay, let's see how the game goes. White plays king to h1. You go ahead and castle. I'm worried about the trapped knight here too, though. Whenever a knight's behind the enemy pawn chain like this, and has trouble finding safe squares, that's always a concern. I'm trying to see how I would exploit this. I think bishop d5 is actually very annoying for you, because bishop d5 is a good move because it stops f5 to defend the knight because of the pin. And I think black is going to have to play something like knight g5. But wrecking the pawns here is really not ideal with so much pressure on the king side. This looks pretty concerning, actually. But our opponent doesn't seem aware of this. They play c3, just solidifying the pawn chain, I guess. And you played a good move here. You played d5, which I think is a very necessary move. This is common in a lot of these King's Gambit lines, to free up your pieces, fight back for the center. So after d5, white could take on passant. I don't think that's such a big concern, though. I think you can either take back with the knight, take back with the queen, and I don't think you have too serious of concerns here anymore, thankfully. Instead, they decided to play bishop b3 and attack your knight. You played bishop to g4. White played knight b to d2. And here, you decided to sacrifice a piece. You said that this was a big, intimidating pawn chain here, and you said, I need to break up this pawn chain, so you sacrificed the knight. That's an interesting word. You said you need to break up the pawn chain. It is an intimidating pawn chain, but giving up a piece is a really drastic thing to do in chess. You usually are going to be at a big disadvantage down a piece. So let's take a look at the result. Knight takes d4, cd4, bishop d4, and you did mention you noticed the knight was pinned. So you thought you could get 2 pawns for the piece. After knight takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4. White gets a pawn back, though, so you're really down a piece for a pawn here, which is a big, big disadvantage. I agree with you that the pawns are a little menacing, but I think we have a better way to tear down this pawn chain. Let's go back. After bishop d3, bishop g4, knight b to d2. What about just exchanging off this knight and playing f6 and trying to tear down the pawn chain this way? This seems like a better way to deal with this pressure than giving up a piece. So it is a little concerning here with the light squares being exposed, but you never want to give up a piece for a pawn unless there's some tactical justification or something. You can't just be annoyed by a pawn chain and just give up a piece for a pawn. The disadvantage from being down that much material is going to be a lot worse than the disadvantage from this pawn chain. Even after f6, though, I think it is pretty clear that white has an advantage here. So it's worth talking about kind of what went wrong. I feel like you had multiple opportunities to kind of exploit the weaknesses of the King's Gambit, either by accepting the pawn on move 2 and trying to hold on, or by exploiting this weak diagonal in the opening. But once black doesn't do that, white really gets the kind of positions they're looking for in the King's Gambit. They just have more active pieces, a strong center, and you didn't even make him sacrifice a pawn to get it. So that's my explanation of why black has a disadvantage now. But the game's not over. You can definitely fight back. Until you give up the piece, then white has a big advantage like we were talking about. So c takes d4, bishop d4, a lot of pieces start coming off. You play c5 to try to solidify that bishop in there. Yeah, it wouldn't be ideal to move the bishop away and go to the endgame down a piece. That would not be fun. c5, queen to b3. Yeah, that looks like a good move, putting some pressure on some potentially vulnerable pawns. You exchange off that bishop. Okay. Okay, yeah, you're just trying to go for some counterplay here. Yeah, when you're down a piece, you just have to kind of take some risks, mix it up, hope your opponent misses something. Bishop to f4. That looks like a sensible move by your opponent. And you say you don't hate your position here. You said that you feel kind of comfortable here, but that's interesting though. You're down a piece. When you're down a piece, you really need something special to justify it. You say your opponent has a weak back rank. I don't really see that. I think their back rank is pretty well defended. I don't see a way to exploit the weak back rank. But okay, let's go ahead and see what happens. So you play bishop takes e5, trying to win a second pawn for your piece and exploit this pin. Because if the bishop takes, you're going to get a piece back. Your opponent plays rook a to f1. Yeah, your opponent really has all their pieces in the game now, and a lot of pressure on f7, potentially too, after this bishop comes in to help potentially as well. You bring a rook into the game with rook a to d8, queen b7. Yeah, objectively this is just winning here for white, but I am curious to see what kind of resistance you put up and if you were able to make a fight of this. Rook to d2. Okay, all right, you're trying to get some play there on the second rank. Bishop takes c5. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, it looks like you forgot that queen takes b7 actually defends this bishop, and now there's no more pin. So you probably have to exchange off now, unfortunately, although then all the pressure on f7 is really a problem. But this just sacrifices a piece. Actually, doesn't this lose a rook too? This move's not possible, is it? What happens if white play... Oh no, sorry, they cannot play this because of checkmate. But they can take the other way. They can take your bishop, and now you're down 2 pieces. One thing I noticed in your comments, you talk a lot about pawn chains. At this position, you said you didn't hate your position because, like after b6, you'll have this strong pawn chain, and then we go forward a few moves. When they took on b7, you said, unfortunately, you forgot about making this pawn chain, and now that's why your position's bad. And of course, earlier in the game, you were so worried about white's pawn chain here, you were willing to give up a piece for it. So pawn chains are an important concept to understand, but it feels to me like you might be overvaluing them. I would definitely reevaluate if you're valuing, a strong pawn chain as being worth more than a full piece. Just something to keep in mind. Anyway, queen takes b7, rook to d2, and you lose a second piece. Queen to g4. Rook g3, queen e2. All right, I like how you're still fighting back. White could potentially blunder and somehow get mated if he's not careful. Although g7's hanging right now. You mentioned one other move after rook to g3 and say maybe this was a better chance. Maybe this was even winning, you say, just to play rook to d1. Yeah, it's a clever idea to exploit the weak back rank, but white's more than able to defend with all their extra material. For example, I think queen b5 is fine. I don't see a way for black to really do anything here. Your queen's hanging. Exchanging here isn't going to accomplish much. If you exchange and take this piece, you're going to run into the same problem with rook takes g7 and losing the queen, potentially. Or just something like this is plenty fine. Yeah, there's just no way to really exploit this weak back rank, unfortunately, if white's careful. But back to the game, after queen to e2, yeah, just giving up the g7 pawn, and this just leads to mates. King h8, rook g3, f6, and checkmate. Yeah, so good job trying to fight back, trying to make something happen. Unfortunately, white's just up so much material here, it just wasn't enough, and white was able to win the game. So really, from my perspective here, the main reason you lost the game, you lost 2 pieces. You gave one up voluntarily, and then you forgot about this pin that didn't exist anymore and gave up the second piece. And being down 2 pieces, it's just really hard to fight back in that situation. Even if you have more active pieces, even if you have better pawn chains, down 2 pieces, it's usually not going to matter. So I guess my 2 main recommendations to you, Jazeerajam, just from looking at this game, is 1, I would recommend valuing material a little bit more. I know a lot of players overvalue material, but this is a rating level, especially this 1200, 1300 rating level, where a lot of games are won and lost just by one player blundering material and the other player having an extra piece or 2 extra pieces and just converting that into a win. It's very important to get those fundamentals down before you start, getting too fancy. So I would try to value material a little bit more than you currently do. It's really good that you're thinking about positional considerations like pawn chains, but material is important, especially when we're talking about full pieces being sacrificed and not just pawns. And my second recommendation, okay, you got surprised in the opening. You're an e5 player against e4. You're not too familiar with the King's Gambit. White surprised you with it here, and you were kind of on your own from move 2, which is, a scary feeling. Usually, move 2, you're still making your book moves. You're still prepared. You've seen the position before. Being on your own on move 2, obviously that's a daunting situation. But okay, you got surprised. The important thing is just make sure it doesn't happen again. Now you've seen the King's Gambit. You lost a game in it. There's plenty of free resources out there on the internet. You can watch some videos on YouTube about the King's Gambit. You can look at some databases that recommend how to play against the King's Gambit. Just spend a little time preparing for the King's Gambit and you'll be ready for it next time. All right. Thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you again soon.